We now head to Nigeria, where the country's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu on Saturday pledged Nigeria's commitment to end gas flaring as part of its contribution to the global push to reduce methane emissions. Tinubu said this before world leaders on Saturday at the COP28 summit on methane and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases in Dubai, the United Arab Emirates. Tinubu spoke alongside the COP28 President Dr. Ahmed Al-Jabbar, the United States Special Envoy on Climate John Kerry, and the Chinese Envoy on Climate Xi Zhuhan, saying Nigeria has incentives and punitive measures to encourage compliance and also punish defaulters. Commending the Emirati government for its drive to reduce CGHGs, the president welcomed new developments made by the entities, harping on the need for participants to implement their net zero commitments. And of course, to discuss this, we are joined on the news at this time by Temitope Kolade, Senior Manager and Lead ESG and Climate Change Services at Andersen. He joins from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time, Temitope.
Thanks for having me.
All right, great. Now, what specific measures or strategies has Nigeria actually outlined to fulfill its commitment to ending gas flaring and also reducing methane emissions? And how achievable are some of these goals and the timelines too?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. One of the things that we've seen the federal government done in recent times is the passage of the Petroleum Industry Act in particular. And one of the things that that act does is to ensure that when companies that are involved in upstream petroleum activities flare gases, they would have to pay penalties. And to add to the injury for them is that when they pay those penalties, they are not deductible for tax purposes. So those penalties are not recoverable from a tax point of view, and that's impactful for the investors in those companies. Right. Beyond that is also that we've seen the passage of the Climate Change Act, and that's sort of the establishment of the Nigerian, Climate Change Council. And that's now responsible for clear climate change actions and how to mainstream it into the various sectors of the economy. So a couple of things happening at the moment. One of the things you also see is the establishment of a project by the Federal Ministry of Environment, the Hydrocarbon Pollution Remediation Project, and a couple of actions that they're actually taking to deal with whatever issues we see with climate change. And when you talk about the timelines with respect to gas flaring in particular, it's basically saying that by 2030, we want to reduce to a particular number, and there are clear guidelines as to what will happen if you continue to flare, and most companies will not want to get that it's going forward. So the overall timeline really is that net zero for Nigeria is we're looking at 2060, right, which kind of realistic from the point of the former president when he made that presentation at COP27.
Now, in what ways does Nigeria plan to incentivize compliance and also enforce punitive measures to discourage gas flaring and hold defaulters accountable? And how might these measures actually impact on the energy sector and also business operations within the country?
Well, in terms of enforcement of punitive measures, I mentioned something earlier. We have the the Nigerian Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, for instance, that is empowered to issue regulations with respect to fines for gas flaring in line with the Petroleum Industry Act. And to add to it is the fact that those fines are not eligible for cost recovery or tax deductibility, right? So those penalties are things that are clearly specified in the flare gas prevention of waste and pollution regulations, right? The only conditions that you begin to see maybe there is some incentive around it is to say there could be an emergency, there may be a very great need for safety to flare gas. There could be an exemption granted by the NUPRC itself, or maybe it's an acceptable safety practice at that point, it would be flared. Right. And again, if you're going to have to flare at all, you have to, any company, licensee or lessee has to actually produce something that is called a gas flare elimination plan. Right. When we then talk about the sort of incentive that you could get. I know that the government is also working around things around some sort of carbon credits, right? That if they're also helping to remove the greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, right? You could get some credits for doing that. That's not really at the advanced stage. And I know that there are conversations ongoing here and there, but so much for now, there is, I won't say there are very many incentives to incentivize compliance, but in terms of enforcement, we have punitive measures to discourage people from flaring gas. And of course, like I said earlier, it would impact on the bottom line for every company that continues to flare gas, especially those within the upstream sector of the oil and gas industry.
Of course, Nigeria being the economic powerhouse of the continent, how significant will you say President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's pledge on the global stage at the COP28 summit on methane and other non-CO2 greenhouse gases? What significance will his pledge actually have, not just on Nigeria, but also cascading to the African continent itself?
Okay, well, I feel like it's what we call the tone at the top, right? As much as sometimes the promises don't actually, they don't necessarily dovetail into critical actions, but we expect that those comments and commitments would actually result in clear action plans. And like I said earlier, there are a couple of steps being taken here and there, but the most important is that we are able to actually galvanize sustainable development for every sector, and we give the right livelihood to the people on the streets of Nigeria, because that's the only way we can really fight this sort of climate change issues that we're having with the emission of greenhouse gases. So we expect that when they do come back with the Ministry of Environment delegates and every other delegate that has gone to that COP28, they will tell us what critical plans they have and actionable steps they are bringing into place, maybe from the point of disclosure and reporting and the point of incentivizing, like one of the things that we mentioned, for instance, developing a clear carbon credit framework for Nigeria. Those are the expectations, right? And what sort of funding we are able to galvanize from these meetings that they're also having to ensure that we have the right kind of development. And that way we can then begin to see that, oh, it's not just mere talk, but we are seeing actions. But one thing, it's clear that the tone at the top really matters. Everyone that has gone with the president should have a take home from the event to say that, you know what, we also have a responsibility to ensure that the commitment of the president is not just mere promises, but they're going to be developed into actionable steps and they're going to take those actions.
All right, now let's talk about the role Nigeria actually envisions for itself in the global push to reduce emissions, especially considering its status as a major oil and gas producer in Africa. And how might this commitment actually influence other African nations facing similar challenges to maybe do likewise?
Well, definitely, I think that they would follow suit. Very many times we see that the other African countries learn a lot from Nigeria being, quote and unquote, the African giant, right? But one thing is sure, that we have our revenues coming from crude for the most part, especially our foreign exchange, right? And that's to say that we really need to find the way to balance things with respect to energy transition issues. For instance, the budget was presented to the National Assembly a few days ago, and that also implied that we're having commitments as to say, oh, we're expecting 1.78 million barrels per day. And of course, OPEC is saying you cannot even get as much as that. And that has to do with sustainability. So for us, in a way, we need to think, look back as a country and say, how do we ensure that we begin to diversify away from crude? And if we do that, we can get other countries to also see, African countries to see that this is a trajectory that Nigeria is making in this regard. One of the things that I commend about Nigeria at the moment is that we're actually taking a very good step in being early adopters of the IFRS S1, S2, which is also something around getting companies to report their actions with respect to sustainability and climate change issues, risk, opportunities, targets, and all of that. And that, again, is sending some signals to other African countries that that's the way to go, because it would help attract some investment into the country. When they see that those are the sort of benefits that Nigeria is taking, they would follow suit, I believe, that, oh, that's the way to go.
All right, thank you so much for your time. Temitope Kolade, Senior Manager and Lead, ESG and Climate Change Services at Andersen, of course, joining from Lagos, Nigeria. Once again, thank you.
Thanks, Dapo, for having me.